Good morning and welcome back to this 11th Wednesday's Bible Reflection with Dr. Vinoth Ramachandra. And it is my privilege to welcome Dr. Vinoth, and we all wish him him a Independence Day, him and Sri Lankans all around. So today's devotion has been chosen from Luke chapter 10, 25 to 37. Who is my neighbor? So now I give this time to Dr. Vinoth.
Yeah, let's just pray before we begin. Lord, I pray that you will take my words, speak through them. Pray that you would take our minds and think through them. And pray that you would take our lives and live through them. In the name of Jesus. Amen. Right, so if you remember the very first Bible reflection that I did, I think a year ago, was from Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel. And I said how one of the things I love about the early chapters of Genesis is how we meet a God who comes to us not as the answer to our problems or our questions, but as a God who comes to us as a question to which we have to answer. And one of the infuriating aspects of Jesus' style of teaching was the way that he asked more questions of people than he gave them answers. In fact, one scholar has estimated that in the gospel stories, there are more than 160 times when Jesus asks a question, and comparatively few places where he directly answers a question. In fact, often when he's asked a question, he will put a counter question back to the inquirer. And we see this happening here in this well-known story from Luke chapter 10, which is traditionally called the parable of the Good Samaritan. You have a lawyer, strictly he would have been what today we call a theologian, somebody who studied the Torah, the law of Moses, a legal scholar, coming to Jesus and asking him a question. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Very similar to the question that the rich young ruler later on also asks Jesus. And Jesus puts a counter question. What do you read in the law? What you're studying? What does the law actually say? And then he replies, the traditional Shema, which in Israel was a kind of a summary of their basic belief. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength. And then he couples that with Leviticus 19, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which in the Jewish world was extended to the resident alien who lived amongst the Jews and who embraced the law of Moses. And Jesus commends his understanding. But now he says to them, you have given the right answer, do this and you will live. So notice he doesn't say, because you know this, you will live, but do this and you will live. That sound practice, obedience, matters more than sound doctrine or sound theology. But then we read that he, seeking to justify himself, then asks the question, who then is my neighbor? So Luke brings out the underlying motive of this theologian, to justify himself. If only he could draw a neat division between human beings, if he could divide the world into those people towards whom he had a legal or moral obligation, and those to whom he had no legal or moral obligation, then he could select actually what obedience he is going to render and to whom. Now, in almost every society, people are brought up to give their primary allegiance to their family, and then to their ethnic group, and then perhaps to their nation state. So we are brought up to divide the world into insiders and outsiders. And most of the popular movies that we see, whether Bollywood or Hollywood, or movies from Taiwan or Korea, these are all celebrating the hero who takes vengeance on those who have harmed his family or harmed his nation. Okay, and today Sri Lanka is celebrating Independence Day, and again there'll be lots of speeches on our duty to the nation, building Sri Lanka. And the church often thinks in the same way. We inside the church, we are the saved, and those who don't belong to us, those who are outside the church, well, they are the lost. Now, have you noticed that the very first words of Jesus' public ministry, according to Luke, the sermon that he gives in the synagogue at Nazareth, challenge this nationalist, insular worldview, a worldview that was shared by his own family and the townsfolk in Nazareth. Instead of assuming the messianic role that was expected by the Jewish nationalists and announcing a holy war on their enemies, the Romans, Jesus in his sermon holds up as examples of God's compassion two people who stood outside God's covenant with Israel: the widow of Zarephath, who gave her last food and water to the prophet Elijah, and Naaman, the Syrian soldier. These are the two examples that Jesus chooses in his very first public sermon. And then, when he invites people to become part of his inner circle, the 12 apostles, he chooses people who normally would never associate with each other. You have a tax collector who is working for the Romans, you have a bunch of fishermen, and you have a zealot, probably somebody who had joined the zealot movement against Rome. And while Jesus decisively rejected the Roman understanding of power and of government, that rejection did not extend to individual Roman people. And Luke relates the story of the 10 lepers who are healed by Jesus, but only one of them, the Samaritan, someone whose mixed ancestry and heretical theology made them objects of contempt to every devout Jew, only the Samaritan is praised by Jesus for his spiritual sensitivity. He's the only one who comes back and thanks Jesus. And now we find Jesus telling this lawyer theologian a story which would have outraged most of his hearers. To be invited by Jesus to learn from a Samaritan the kind of behavior that God is pleased with, the God of Israel. This was a direct assault on their religious identity, their national identity. Now, one of the problems that we face whenever we listen to the parables of Jesus is, where do we locate ourselves in the story? And also, where do we locate God in the story? Now, this is one of the disconcerting aspects of the parabolic style that Jesus embraced. They are not straightforward preaching. Now, it's customary for preachers to identify ourselves with the Levite and the priest, who just ignore the man who is lying there injured on the roadside, beaten by bandits. And this is in keeping with Jesus' own denunciation of the temple establishment in Jerusalem. So the religious professionalism often blinds us to the everyday needs of others. We turn our backs on a hurting world, absorbing ourselves in our church services, our religious rituals. If we are theological college lecturers or we are research scholars in Tracy, we are too busy preparing maybe our class assignments or writing that article that we want published in a journal or working on our next book. We are so absorbed with these that we dare not pay attention to the plight of those in our immediate neighborhood or even in our college or our university. Or we are fearful, for we suspect that it will demand more of us than just a single charitable donation. If perhaps we really got involved in the lives of others, it might call for a change of direction in our lives. We may have to give up a certain research project and focus on something very different. We may actually have to make a detour, not just for a few years, but perhaps for the whole of our lives, changing complete direction. So that is why we are often fearful of getting involved. We don't want our plans and our projects to be upset. Now, Jesus teaches us that to be a disciple is to imitate Him, to imitate God. But where is God in the parable? The early church actually identified the Samaritan with Jesus himself, the one who we saw responds to human need throughout his ministry, irrespective of people's social status or religious affiliation. He not only binds up his wounds, but takes him to a local inn. He pays for his long-term treatment and his restoration to health. But can we perhaps also see Jesus as the man who has been beaten up by bandits and left to die? And there is a tradition going back to the early church that also identified Jesus with the injured man. After all, that is how the ministry of Jesus ended. And Jesus continues to identify himself with all such innocent victims of injustice and violence. And we saw that in the story of Cain and Abel. So Jesus is the vulnerable one in our world, the political refugee, the tortured political dissident, the child who is starving, the abused single mother. And those who respond to Jesus, the victim, are the true imitators of God, the true disciples. And Jesus made this very clear. Now it's interesting that the most neglected person in the story is the innkeeper. And in some ways, he's the most interesting, because borders are now being reshaped, reconfigured. Because this stranger, who's not mentioned by name, not only cares for the wounded man, but he also trusts this foreigner, the Samaritan. He receives from him the money and trusts that he will return and pay all his dues, all his medical bills. There is trust for a foreigner, an outsider. And so we come to the final question that Jesus poses to the legal scholar. And it's the most important of all, for it goes to the very heart of the parable. What was a question about, who is my neighbor? Can I identify my neighbor? The question is turned around by Jesus into, who do you think behaved in a neighborly way to this man? The Samaritan is constituted as a neighbor by his neighborly action towards a stranger. He receives his life by willing to pour out his life for a stranger. So as so often in the teaching of Jesus, nouns are turned into verbs and adverbs. God doesn't care what we think about the Bible, our doctrine of Scripture. What matters is how we use the Bible. He does not care whether we call ourselves Christians or evangelicals or whatever label we like. What matters is whether we act in a Christian way. So that's the question he asks the lawyer. Who do you think acted in a neighborly way? And if you treat someone in a neighborly way, he becomes your neighbor, just as you are now constituted as a neighbor to him. Today, in our globalized world, our neighbor is somebody whom we may never meet on the street. We may never meet him even in our lifetime, but somebody who perhaps at the other end of the world, who is affected by the decisions that we make. What food we eat, what clothes we wear, where are these manufactured? These are questions these are acts that affect people around the world. Climate change, environmental pollution doesn't respect borders. We in Sri Lanka, for example, we are breathing polluted air that's coming to us from India because the northeast monsoon is bringing bad air to our country. So every time I check the weather report, we're told the air pollution index is very bad because of this air that's coming to us across the border, across the sea. The COVID pandemic didn't respect borders. So in our globalized world, unlike the world in which Jesus and the lawyer, the theologian, were living in, is a world in which perhaps our neighbors are those we never encounter face to face physically, but they are constituted as our neighbors through our actions, whether harmful actions or good, beneficial actions. Now, we can also use our imagination, as we must when reading parables, and try to extend perhaps the parable in this way. Supposing the parable went on to say that every day the Samaritan making this journey, say from Jericho to Jerusalem, or from Jerusalem to Jericho, we are not sure in what direction he was moving. Supposing that every day he comes across a person who's lying there wounded, injured, at the point of death. And then he stops and asks himself, now why is this happening? He does some research. He studies the situation. Perhaps he plants some cameras on the trees to catch what is happening. And he notices that this band of bandits is out there every morning, and they are hand in glove with the local police. They are paying bribes to the local police. Then it becomes a problem of police corruption. Or perhaps he studies the situation and he realizes that these people are lying injured on the road not because of any bandit gangs or corrupt police. It's just that they're coming from a village where there is malnutrition. They're not getting enough to eat. And so they faint, they collapse on the journey, and they lie there injured and starving. And then it becomes a problem of how do we then address the problem of malnutrition in that village. So you see, this is where charity and compassion now moves towards economic and social justice. Okay? The Desert Fathers in the 3rd and 4th centuries were Christians who moved out into the Syrian and Egyptian deserts to seek God more deeply, because they were fed up with the corruption, the evil of the society in which they lived, even though it had become nominally Christian after the conversion, so-called, of the Emperor Constantine. And many Christians would go after these desert fathers to seek guidance as to how they were to live within a pagan society. A story is told of some brothers who went to see Abba Felix, one of the Desert Fathers, and they begged him for a word of advice, a word of wisdom. But the old man kept silent. And after they had pressed him for a long time, he said to them, "Do you wish to hear a word?" And they said, "Yes, Abba." And then the old man said to them, "There are no more words these days, because when the brothers used to consult the old men, and when they did what was said to them, God showed the old men how to speak. But now, since they ask without doing that which they hear, God has withdrawn the grace of the word from the old men, and they do not find anything to say, since there are no longer any who carry their words out." And hearing this, the brothers groaned, saying, "Please pray for us, Abba." When did you last hear a pastor, a preacher, a theological lecturer telling you, "I have nothing more to teach you"? Because until you first practice what you learned last Sunday or in your last theology class, unless you first put that into practice, I have no more wisdom, nothing else to share with you. So let's spend a few moments in silence, and then I invite you to respond. But isn't it true that we hear and hear and hear, and yet it's only as we learn to act on what we hear that we receive more wisdom, we grow. Which is why I always look for opportunities to teach others whatever I have read or heard that has challenged me. I feel an obligation to share it with others, but also the more I share with others, I grow in my understanding of what I have received. If I keep it to myself, I forget. If I keep it to myself, I forget it, or it just doesn't have any lasting effect in my life.
Thank you so much, Vinod, for the reflection. Since you asked us how have we been translating, I must thank you for the years in which I have followed you, though we may not have acknowledged. But it has helped me a lot, actually, to be more clear and definite about the positions that I take, and to be also able to articulate it. Because one thing that I've heard, listen to you and also, learn from you is the fact that to be upfront and direct about what you understand and what you think of passages and issues, and not to be very careful or, you know, sometimes when we communicate, though we may believe we are a little, the way we put it comes across as we are not sure or we're a little bit uncertain. Of course, with your teaching and with others who have also taught us, in my teaching, in the places where I've taught, whether at JNUCF or in UESI circles or the articles that I've been writing, God has helped me to be more forthright and a little more courageous. And I'm grateful to God for that. I want to thank you. Not that we have arrived or done everything well or correctly, not that we are perfect. We are trying very hard. And as far as God's grace is there, we've tried.
Sure,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, we all need wisdom when to be forthright and
Mhm.
when to actually say, yes, we are not sure. We also have our doubts. There are some issues that are not clear cut, and we can think about it in in different ways. So we need wisdom to know when to be direct, forthright, not to surrender, not to give in, and when to actually admit that we ourselves are still learning and we don't have any clear, definite answers to every question. That requires wisdom. Supposing I was in that African congregation, a question that I would ask is, okay, supposing I'm the person lying there beaten and praying that God will send help. Supposing the person who stops and helps me, somebody from a tribe that my family have told me are my enemies, and I should have nothing to do with them. Will I accept help from that person? Because sometimes accepting help from our enemies is as difficult as giving help to our enemies. So there are various ways we can challenge an audience depending on the context in which we are studying the passage or preaching from the passage. We're always trying to contextualize the biblical passage, the biblical text.
Just yesterday, last night, I was just reading about Western pharmaceutical companies and their pricing versus the pricing of medicines, especially for heart and cancer in India. And so in that article, I was just also saying how some of the Indian negotiators were, negotiating on the whole issue of process patent and product patent. And the American and Western have more of product patent, but in India, we used to use till recently process patent. The prices are almost like, you can say, almost 1,000% higher. And one of the comments made by a pharmaceutical CEO to the Indians was that, see, these medicines are made for the rich Westerners who can afford it, not for the poor Indians. So I could just see the injustice that is happening, that medical care or medicines are not affordable, and the intellectual property rights are also very unjust. And then I came to know that in that particular study, that India took advantage of the process patent for many years till it was negotiated recently. Most of the patents are only for about 20 years. And then they have a practice called evergreening, where they make incremental changes to the product and extend the patent for another 20 years. So most of the pharma companies been doing this. And where India recently, what they did is that the Supreme Court said that only incremental changes, we will not be giving product patent here in India. So I could see one thing is that, we say the Western civilization, especially the right wingers and all, consider it based on, the Christian, Protestant work ethic and thinking. But I would see that there is a lot of injustice, and we are the poor neighbor, right? And towards the poor neighbor, like I can see the Samaritan as the one who takes care and tends for the wounded man. But here we can see an entire wounded, you can say the majority world, where the minority world, especially the pharma and the medical industry, is only based on profit, and the margins are huge. So there, I could see an injustice, and I could stand with although the things are not very just, even in the Indian corporate world also. This is some of the injustices that came very strongly, which I could associate also with when you were leading this reflection on who is your neighbor. And it's my heart's cry that the Western Christians understand that who is their neighbor, especially their concern for the majority world, who are not able to afford for expensive medical care, like cancer treatments and all, 1,000%, 2,000%, 4,000% higher, and some of the even heart and some of, so these are some of the injustices where our law system is trying to address but still is unjust. So some of the thoughts that came, as I was reflecting on when you took this session, this study on who is the neighbor.
Yeah, thanks, Billy. Yes, you're right. And even these IT companies, AI. I remember once watching a building going up, a big tower in Bangalore, I think, for a big IT company, Western IT company. And I was thinking as I watched the construction, how many of these construction workers and their children will be able to afford the software that these companies are producing? Because they will be patented, they will have to buy the software, they won't be able to afford it. And yet, without their labor, these IT companies couldn't function. Or think of all the Indians who are laboring in call centers and because a lot of these Western companies outsource their operations to India or Sri Lanka, and we have lots of people involved in these call centers. And so we are actually contributing to the development of these programs, algorithms, and all that. And yet, at the end of the day, they are sold to us not at reduced prices, but at the same prices that would apply in the West. So I will have to buy my Windows 11 package, not at a price that is reduced because I'm living in Sri Lanka, but pay the same that somebody pays for in America. So you're right, this is injustice. But I would take the Christian argument further and say not only think about the neighbor in India or Africa who is affected by actions in America or Europe, but I would say to my American and European friends, you were not baptized into the American church or the British church or the German church. You were baptized into the global body of Christ. So your primary identity is that you are a Christian first, and then an American or an Englishman or a German, second or third. But most American Christians, the vast majority, think of themselves first as Americans and then only as Christians. And the same is true of Sri Lankans and Indians, no? We are first Tamils, or we are first Malayalis, or we are first Kuki. And then how many of us think, no, I'm first a Christian. That is my primary loyalty. And if what my group or my nation is doing to another nation is seriously affecting my brothers and sisters in that other group or in that other nation, then I have to challenge, I have to openly confront the wrong that my group or my nation state is doing. So just think that if we Christians actually woke up to the fact this is basic gospel stuff, no, our basic gospel identity, and we truly live as God's church in the world, think of the influence, think of the impact that we can have, in our world. Certainly we will be hated. We will be accused of all kinds of things, of being traitors and so on. We will suffer, but also we will show the difference that being a Christian actually makes to our politics. Yeah, Anne has another question. Faith alone, Luther's faith alone statement to nullify verses and do this and you will live. Have you come across this a bit? Well, yes, and that's again because I think people don't read the whole Bible. They don't read everything that Luther said. Faith is invisible. The only way that faith can be seen as genuine faith is through our works. And that is why whenever Jesus and even Paul and James and others speak of God's final judgment, the judgment is always on the basis of our works, what we have done, because judgment is a public event. It's not a private event. And so the only way that we show that we have put our trust in Jesus and depend on Him for our salvation is through our obedience to Jesus. You know? Just as in Ephesians 2, Paul says, we have been saved through grace by faith in order to do those good works which God has prepared beforehand that we should walk in, those works of justice, those works of mercy.
I was just thinking about, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the passage that we read and reflecting upon it. And the Samaritan was a stranger in this case. And sometimes when we are confronted with strangers, we are fearful because we are fearful to help because they may not be, telling the truth, or they may take advantage of us. So, at least this is what I've been thinking. At least in two instances, when I've come across people like children, for example, who have, when you buy them pineapples, when they're begging, when you buy them pineapples, they actually they might have an understanding with the shopkeeper. So they say, "I'll collect it later." So these kind of things, how do we deal with it when it comes with strangers? So I've always doubted whether to act or not to act.
Yes, that's a bit of a difficult question. So again, notice the Samaritan didn't only put medicine into the wounds of the injured person and bind it up with bandages. He put him on his donkey and took him to the inn for long-term treatment. It wasn't just an instant, not just giving a few rupees to the person, which is what we are tempted to do. So I think the reason we don't get more involved in the people's lives, and I'm speaking here of myself as well, is because we know it's going to take a lot of our time. And maybe actually more than just a casual handout. It may actually be taking this person to hospital, or it may be, if a person is without a job, helping him to find a job, or actually going and visiting him in his home and meeting his or her children, finding out what their needs are. It takes up a lot of time and effort, but that is genuine love. That's genuine concern. But also, like I said, sometimes even doing research, doing study on real social problems, real social needs, and then trying to translate those into advocating for government policies, that is also an expression of long-term costly help. A lot of NGOs, the way that they try to raise money, for example, is showing us pictures of starving children, and that's how they get money. And people will just give. They'll send a check, they'll send, money. But that may not be the biggest need. Maybe if we invested in, say, good women's literacy programs, improve the level of women's education in that country, then the problem of child malnutrition might be taken care of. That's a more long-term solution. But you see, advertising for or asking for money for a women's education program may not be as attractive. It doesn't stir our hearts in the way that showing pictures of starving children will do. you see. So that is the way that actually often NGOs raise funds, and it may not be actually the best way to deal with real problems. Also, my wife used to often say, when people said, why are you helping that beggar? You know he's going to take that money and spend it on drink. And she would say, it doesn't matter. At least when he's drunk, he's happy for a short time. And she used to say, look, we are all the time we are being cheated by rich people. They cheat us. They're making money by charging us exorbitant fees, like Billy was saying, the drugs that we are buying. We are being exploited. We are being cheated. So why should we care if we ourselves are now cheated by some poor people? Isn't it better to be cheated by the poor than to be cheated by the rich? That's what she would ask. So
I have a question. Thank you for such a profound teaching, and learned a lot from you. And I think I agree with whatever exegetical connotations you have brought forward. And I wanted to take this thing into a very political dilemma, but I think I'll just leave it because people are expressing their personal concerns. So, from my very personal concern, I would like to ask that loving thy neighbor for me was whoever I communicate with becomes my neighbor for me. That's what I used to tell my wife, that even if I communicate with my house help or someone, she becomes my neighbor. And to that extent, we have somehow, do you say, I won't say frowned upon, but kind of made our application of the word in that. I just wanted to ask you that sometimes what happens is that we tend to overhelp people in a way that we are unable to do it. So then, when we are unable to do it, there is a guilt that stays within my heart. I don't know about my wife as of now, of loving thy neighbor. That whoever calls for help, we try our best to help them, and at times we fail to do that. So, how have you been through such kind of emotions or something, guilt, and how would you deal with that? Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
um, I wasn't sure what you meant when you said did you say you over communicate?
No, I would say, I won't say over. I'm not getting the word, but I would say that I over try to help people at times. That's what happens, and sometimes we fail to help them because of that. We don't have the resources. Actually, yeah, that's the point to make. We don't have the resources to somehow help others to the extent that they need the help, and then this
Yes.
guilt kind of overtakes us. That what can we do for this? So,
Yes, I mean, so sometimes it is not what we do as individuals that can really help. Like I gave some examples of where it's a social justice issue, and so it might be actually working with other people, with local government agencies, or with an NGO, or even a local church, collectively trying to address this problem in a village or in a neighborhood in a city. So it's collective action and not just individual action. But I will also challenge what you said about whoever I can communicate with is my neighbor, because there are some people whom we cannot communicate with. Think of unborn children, a human fetus, a human embryo. Think of people who are severely disabled, a person suffering from dementia, Alzheimer's, or who's paralyzed, you know, and yet they are our neighbors. So it is not only those whom we can communicate with and who can communicate back to us who are our neighbors. And that's why I said the question Jesus puts is who behaves in a neighborly way towards this injured man. So if we behave in a neighborly way towards a embryonic human being, an unborn human child, or a severely disabled adult, we are actually making them our neighbors. We are constituting them as our neighbors. It is our action that makes them now our neighbors. They have become my neighbor and I have become their neighbor. So we don't just first decide who can I communicate with and then choose that person to be a neighbor, but it's the other way around. That it is our action simply because they're human beings. You know, we share a common humanity. We are made in the image of God. Okay? It is that now moves me to act in a neighborly way, and then I recognize them as my neighbor. Anybody else?
So thank you, Dr. Vinoth, for this profound teaching on what it truly means to be a neighbor, and for reframing the Good Samaritan parable in such a relevant way in today's context, and reminding us that discipleship requires action rather than just doctrinal knowledge or words. So thank you for that.